Hello Seekers! Today is Wednesday, the 15th of April 2020. This is Vincent, and I'm here as always with Vian Den Groot and I. Let's go deeper into our observation of the state of world affairs during this pandemic of COVID-19. And today I want to focus on the economic point of view. As always, whenever I look at things, I like to look at least at 3 points of views. In the case of my spiritual research, I like to consider the point of view of the ego, the point of view of the higher self, and the point of view of spirit. When I look at a personal decision I want to make, I like to look at the point of view from the instinct, the point of view from the intellect, and the point of view from intuition. And now, when we are talking about society and geopolitics and economics, I like to consider things from the 3 points of views of, number one, the citizen, the human being. Number two, the politicians, the public groups of people. And number three, the businessman or the groups of special interests. So, in terms of the economy, we need to define it. As usual, I like to start with the big picture, then look into the mechanics of it, so that then we can analyze the exact situation. In the case of an economy, we can define it in different ways, depending on how inclusive we want to be. I would have liked a definition that includes various systems which may not be transactional, like what can be seen in a commune or in an aboriginal tribe. But for today's exercise, I think it's better if we stick to the transactional mode of economic system that we are living in today, so that we can understand the situation of this crisis. So today we can define an economy as a system that allows market operators to transact, to exchange natural resources on one hand and man-made goods and services on the other between themselves, in a way that records their transactions and that maintains a permanent liability between them and reliability. So, in that context, an economic system really rests on 3 legs. First and foremost, the market participants. Second, the accounting system. And third, the currencies. And in today's world, we have about 7.7 billion people on the planet, and obviously they are all market participants at some degree. We have also a few 100 million private companies and a few 100,000 public institutions. And that's already where we can see that some problems are coming, because in terms of liability and reliability, human beings have unlimited liability usually, while private limited liability companies by definition have a limited liability, which means that they are authorized not to honor their liabilities if they exceed their capital. Of course, it means they have to dissolve, but nevertheless, that's a real issue. And third, you have public institutions which often don't honor their liabilities in the same way as the other participants. So there is already a bit of compromise here in the current system in terms of the market participants. Then you need a reliable and comprehensive accounting system. And we can see that today in the world, we have audited accounts of companies, and they go into minute details of every bill and invoice. However, the massive value of the natural resources that have come into the equation of the production of their goods and services is simply not accounted for. And third, the currencies, and here again, there is a massive corruption and compromission, because not only do we have multiple currencies, but they are managed by private special interest groups called the central banks, which are private banks, not public as many people think, except in very few countries, and who produce unknown quantities of monetary mass, which means that we have a currency that is not reliable, especially the world reserve currency, the dollar, because nobody knows today how many dollars are exactly in circulation. And there is another major flaw, which is that when a debt is created by a central bank or by a bank, they create the number of dollars or any currency of the principal, but they never create the amount corresponding to the interest. So effectively, the amount of currency in circulation in today's society, in our society, is less than the amount of liabilities, which means that it creates a situation where every people on this planet who have taken up debt, people and companies and institutions who have taken up debt, are competing to do transactions to try and accumulate profit to be able to repay the principal plus the interest and to have a little bit excess profit for itself. However, the sum of money in circulation is only the principals. So it's an impossible equation where by nature, by construction, the system itself ensures that it's impossible for a good portion of the population to ever manage to earn enough to repay its debt and be free of debt. So these are the three fundamental legs of our transactional economy, and all three of them have been corrupted. And that's exactly why we are in the situation we are in today. So let's look at the mechanism. In terms of the transactions going on in the world today, as I said, we have about 7.7 billion human beings, and we have a few 100 million limited liability companies and a few 100,000 public institutions. So let's say a total roughly of 8 billion market participants. And the global GDP of the world today is about $80 trillion. So that's an average of about $10,000 per year per market participant. Of course, as you have guessed it, most of the volume of transaction is limited to the institutions and the private companies. So there is already a major discrepancy here. On top of it, as I mentioned, the private limited liability companies have no obligation to honor their liabilities if it exceeds their capital. So it's a very unfavorable system for any human being who is not part of a powerful institution or company. On top of it, out of this $80 trillion of GDP, about $17 trillion corresponds to service of debt, principal and interest. About $5 trillion of interest and about $12 trillion of principal. So this is already a major problem because we know that the money for the interest does not exist. It has not been created anywhere. And of course, the money for the profit, neither. So when you add the profit plus interest, you probably have a sum of about $17 trillion. And that money does not exist. So we have billions of people and millions of companies just slaving off, running after the illusion that one day they will be able to repay their debt. Some very little minority can succeed and even succeed beautifully, like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or others, who have been champions at appropriating trademarks or natural resources, or to secure exclusive rights from the public. But for the vast majority of those who have taken up debt, they will never succeed in repaying it, and they will simply become more and more enslaved and running after an impossible achievement in a kind of hamster wheel. On top of it, it's even worse than that, because today in the world there is about 260 trillion US dollar of debt. And out of this $260 trillion, if you try and figure out which portion is actually principal and which portion is interest, you would be misled, because you would think from some data that more or less about 200 trillion are the principal and 40 or 60 trillion are the interest. However, it's not the case, because most of the facilities in the world today are refinancing facilities, which capitalize past dues, which were mostly cumulated interest. So truly, out of the $260 trillion of debt today in the world, between public debt, private debt, and so on, and corporate debt, if you really had the possibility to dig down and drill down into the details and go back in the past, you will find out that a vast majority of that amount is actually cumulated interest from past facilities refinanced into new facilities. So truly, the world today is probably short of 2 to 250 trillion US dollar of money, which is just not in existence and needs to exist so that we can see a balancing of the books. Of course, there is a much easier way to balance the books, is simply to reset the entire world economy by canceling all debt, making it illegal for anybody to claim any past debt that is older than, let's say, 31st December 2019. We could even imagine a rule by which the older the debt, the less it can be claimed, and when it's a bit more recent, a bigger portion of it can be claimed. But to be frank, I think that if we want to have a workable economic system in a short period of time, there is no alternative to a complete reset of the economy, change of currencies, change of accounting system, and redefinition of who has the right to be a market participant, under which conditions, of either limited liability for everyone or unlimited liability for everyone. We are very far from that. And it's very strange that we could end up in a situation like this, because, you know, a good half of the world follows one religion or the other. And almost every religion agree that to lend with interest is not allowed, or is not recommended, or is not sustainable. And that many religions also recognize that to make a profit is questionable. And finally, every religion in the world values freedom, values solidarity and fraternity and assistance between people rather than exploitation. On top of it, some religions, like the Jewish religion, for example, they have even in their law what they call a jubilee, which is that every 49 years, they are obliged to forgive all debt. Probably they already found out 3 or 4 or 5,000 years ago that monetary systems are not tenable. If you have a currency and you have interest and profit that has not been created originally, as part of the monetary mass, it's impossible to have a sustainable economy. So, or the only way to function like that is to reset every few decades when the amount of cumulated interest and cumulated profit, but the profit nets off after some time, but the interest never does. This cannot be more than 5 or 10% of the monetary mass without becoming a big problem. And in my humble view, today, the cumulated interest of all debt in the world are probably a very big proportion of the monetary mass. And that's the essential problem we are in. That's what blew up in 2008. I'm a bit eluding the issue of derivatives. We have about $600 or $700 trillion of derivatives just in the US. And we have about $130 trillion of unfunded liabilities also just in the US. So in the world, it's a much bigger amount, but these amounts don't impact the currency, don't impact the accounting system, and don't immediately or directly impact the market operators. So I want to leave them aside for now. So to summarize, we have been living since 50 years in a world where money is debt, where the currency that we are all using, most of us are using dollars in our transactions, at least sometimes, and this currency is mismanaged by a country which for some periods of time cared about the well-being of the entire world, and some other periods of time doesn't care. And obviously, at present, we are in one of those periods when the US care less about the rest of the world, and they handle a huge amount of the currency that most of the world is using, and it's a disaster. It was a disaster already since the 90s. It resulted in the crash of the 2000. It was plastered over. It survived until 2008. Then it crashed even more. It was again not fixed, just plastered over. And now we are in what I believe will be the final crash. But maybe not. Maybe they will manage to keep the ball rolling for another few years. But each time the crash is bigger because the amount keeps accumulating. It's snowballing. So I really hope that this year or next year, the governments of the world will finally decide to fix this problem. I believe that some of the world leaders are already aware and are trying to find a solution, but maybe I'm just taking my wishes for the reality, as I sometimes do. So let's continue our observation of the state of affairs in the world in the context of this global pandemic of COVID-19. So COVID-19 has already claimed officially about 120,000 dead, and we can expect that in the coming 18 months or so, it should reach in the millions. But this is not the first time that humanity is facing a pandemic, and even in the past 20, 30 years, we've had quite a few pandemics that have claimed millions of lives, including some still ongoing today. So we had HIV/AIDS that is still claiming almost 1 million lives every year. We have tuberculosis, which is still claiming more than 1 million lives every year. We still have waterborne diseases, which are claiming almost 1 million lives every year, mostly in Africa. We have quite a number of non-communicable diseases, which are killing millions and millions and millions of people every year. And we have also some addictions to legal drugs like nicotine and alcohol, which are killing about a couple of million people every year. But most of the time, the resources that are deployed to tackle those issues, health issues, are very modest at best a few $billions all over the world, never trillions. So what's so special on this pandemic? How come almost every government has so quickly decided to go to extreme measures and to earmark trillions of dollars, so trillions, that is thousands of billions of US dollars, to tackle a pandemic that has not yet proven that it is most lethal compared to the other pandemics I already mentioned and to other health issues which kill, for example, cardiovascular diseases and strokes kill about 17 million people every year. And we are not declaring a national or a global emergency on that. And generally, the world population is 7.7 billion people today, and every year about 120, 130 million people are born, and about 60 million die of various causes. It's quite difficult to understand very well the causes of death relatively to each other because the main source is the WHO, World Health Organization, and their statistics are, first of all, quite old. Their latest cause of death statistics are from 2016. And second, they do not record any death as natural causes. For them, every death is from a specific cause, such as stroke, cardiac arrest, or non-communicable disease, or communicable disease, or accident, or injury, or self-harm, or things like that. So when we look at those statistics, it's a little bit difficult to separate natural cause of death from the rest. Nevertheless, there are enough information to find out that we have quite a number of sicknesses which are far more lethal than even this COVID-19, which is quite lethal. And as I said, the main difference in this case is how much money has been thrown at the subject. Today, so far, about $5 trillion have been earmarked to fight this disease and its consequences. About $1 trillion has been earmarked to compensate the people who have been under forced stay-at-home orders from most governments. This $1 trillion amounts to more or less between $5,000 and $10,000 per person in the developed world, and between $50 to $500 per person in the rest of the world. As an example, in the Hubei province of China, it seems the Chinese government is planning to pay between $5 to $7 per month per person for 6 months to compensate them for having been in lockdown for a few months. It seems pretty small, but apparently, according to their standard of living, it's not that bad. And then on top of this $1 trillion of direct assistance to people and small and medium-sized enterprises, there was more or less another $4 trillion, so 4 times more, earmarked to provide facilities at very low cost and grants as well to banks and large corporations so that they can refinance at very low cost all their liabilities, good and bad, that have been accumulating in their balance sheet for the past 10, 20 or more years. This is probably going to create a lot of resentment in the population because, as I mentioned, the compensation they are receiving is absolutely not commensurate with the loss and the sacrifice that they are asked to do, while the few people who happen to be close to the power are getting enormous amounts of bailout. And what do they use that amount for? Refinancing, buyback of their own shares on the stock exchange. That's why the stock exchange in New York is so high, despite the enormous crisis we are going through. That's also why companies like Chevron, Equinor, and others, their stock is not going down and sometimes going up while the barrel of oil is going down big time. So we are really in a situation which looks very much like the old saying by Winston Churchill in 1945 when he said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." So what do we see today? We see that since the crisis of 2008, which blew up to expose the enormous amount of leveraged derivative products that was unsustainable, nothing has been fixed. People have just kicked the can for the past 10 years, and of course it's untenable. It was going to blow up anyway. And this pandemic of COVID-19 was the perfect excuse for all the developed nations to do a quick reset and bail in of their banks and large companies which were totally crushed under debt and leverage and bad investments. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. So long, seekers.